but I would say if you spend your whole life trying to burn something down that will never burn down, and then you die, uh, uh, how do you feel about that? Like at
Life
some
well spent.
point, yeah, I tried to burn. I tried to tear down a wall that I was never able to tear down. Like at some point in the process, maybe shifting your energy towards something where at the end of your life you think, I was really grateful that I expended that amount of energy on that thing. uh you know i, I think people should have contemplative reflection about those. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Life After Deconstruction podcast. My name is Anthony Miller, and today I'm very grateful to be able to share with you the part two discussion that I recently had with my friend Stephen Murphy of the Mormonism with the Murph podcast. In this episode, we talk about healing and growth after a faith crisis, the experience of engaging with church apologists, as well as support communities inside and outside the edge of belief. We also talk about nourishing relationships across differentiation of belief, including mixed faith marriages and other mixed faith relationships. I hope you enjoy the episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Latter-day Saint explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. So I'm back here on part two of my epic interview with Anthony Miller. Anthony, thanks for coming back.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Great. So in part one, we talked a little bit about Anthony's faith journey. He talked about his sort of growing up in the church, his faith crisis, and what ultimately led him to lose his faith and leave the church. Then we had a really good discussion on his theory of how the Book of Mormon could have been composed, the mechanics of the dictation, talking about maybe some of the sources or inspiration he might have been pulling from his thoughts on historicity and apologetics. I think it was a good, thoughtful discussion. So go back and watch part one if you haven't. We're going to now veer towards talking a little about sort of like his experience, post losing his faith and finding sort of community and healing and happiness, and also how to navigate both a mixed faith marriage and mixed faith relationships. And there's a video on, is it your YouTube channel, about navigating a mixed faith marriage?
Yeah, it's one of my episodes on my podcast. It's a
Yes.
7.5 minute video with an intro added to it. So it's about
Awesome.
maybe 8.5 minutes long.
So I'll link that in the description. I watched that. I think that's and we're going to talk a little about this in the episode, but yeah, it's important sort of video talking about how to navigate through a mixed faith marriage and some of the tools that people could apply. So we'll start off. Maybe you could talk briefly about, without going into too many details, what it was like for you when you went through your faith crisis and first left, and then how you're able to find sort of healing, community, growth, and sort of come to a place where you feel like you're thriving and happy.
Yeah, sure. So, a faith crisis, at least my faith crisis, was very acute, and it was an existential identity crisis as well as a faith crisis. So, my sense of my being, who I was, how I made sense of life, my roles, my reputation, my family connections, the meaning that I attributed to my spiritual experiences, all of it crumbled. And and people who go through a faith transition related to the church aren't the only ones who experience existential crisis during their lives, right? So different people at different times have different triggers that result in an existential crisis. But for me, um, the result was a very significant amount of grief. Um, that included times of processing or traversing the depression stage of grief. I experienced periods of disassociation. I couldn't understand why God wouldn't answer my prayers just because I read some of the essays on the church's website. What I didn't realize was that I experienced a traumatic identity crisis that led to a significant amount of grief, and that I needed to have healing happen before I could begin to once again experience transcendent connection, love, peace, joy, grace, gratitude types of experiences.
And would you
And
say within the sort of the trauma and depression you felt, was there also a sense of sort of anger and betrayal and frustration
yeah,
as well?
yeah, yeah. I mean, programmed is probably a incendiary word, but I was taught and I believed that if I lost my faith, that it had to be my fault because I did something wrong.
Yeah.
And and so uh, so I experienced during that existential crisis, dark night of the soul stage. Um, I experienced a significant sense of betrayal. First, I sensed self betrayal because um, I applied critical thinking to all the other areas of my life except for my faith. With regard to my faith, I used that model of metaphorically setting aside things that cause dissonance or disconfirming evidence as of books on a metaphorical shelf. And so rather than engaging with those things and sitting with ambiguities and using words that weren't like I know, but using words like I believe or I find helpful or I hope or something like that, I felt like I needed to say that I know. I needed to have certainty. And that led to the metaphorical model of the shelf. Now, I believe the model of the shelf is harmful. So, in my view, let's not ever have a shelf. Let's approach life with epistemic humility.
Yeah.
Let's live in the ambiguity. Let's apply critical thinking to all areas of our life. And
And
for it,
confront probably your issues and doubts and questions and not just leave them to one side.
right, rather than let them accumulate into something that's going to collapse on top of you, right, and cause an identity crisis.
Right.
And so as I was processing the grief of that, I experienced a lot of self-betrayal for not applying critical thinking, for having been exposed to disconfirming information 20 years and more prior and not really dealing with it and kind of almost spiritually bypassing and setting it aside. Um, at the same time, I experienced a significant sense of betrayal from the brethren, and and I need to provide context for this, particularly for people who have gone through faith crisis. So here's the context. So in the past, in history, um, the discipline of history wasn't to provide transparent information about what happened in history. What what was common, or the discipline of history, was to extract uh, faithful or polished narratives about what happened in history that are inspiring to people. So when I
Mm.
grew up, I learned about Washington and the cherry tree, and how loyal he was, right? Which is totally made up story. But that was part of history because it was inspiring and patriotic. And um, growing up, I'm sure that I read a story or heard a story um, that George Washington had false teeth, and that he had wooden false teeth. But what the actual history was is he did have wooden false teeth, but he also owned a lot of slaves. And he had sets of false teeth that were built out of teeth extracted from his slaves, which is not a faithful, polished historical narrative, right?
No, there's a
Um,
reason to want to leave those details out.
there's a reason they want to leave those details out. And so, in any event, the practice of history was to present faithful, polished narratives. And in the church, what we have are individuals who are in leadership who are very, very old, uh, you know, getting older.
Yeah,
I think President Nelson's 98 or something now.
that's right.
And so they grew up and lived in a time when the practice of history was to present a polished narrative. And I had a different values framework in the meanings that I attributed to honesty, integrity, and transparency. particularly working in financial services. It's like that's part of what I have to do for a living. But the role of being honest, like that was one of my core values, and I thrived in Mormonism holding that core value. And then when I learned that the historical narratives in the church were polished narratives to present, you know, Washington and the cherry tree level stuff, or Washington maybe partially accurate, like Washington had false teeth, but he had wooden ones,
Yeah,
but he
just a
also had
very
real
faith
ones.
promoting version of the history. You might
Yeah.
say sanitized,
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah. So
what by what.
I felt extremely betrayed that, for example, when I served my mission, uh, that in my missionary materials, I didn't have the text from the extra First Vision accounts, right? Um, or that I didn't have more information about how polygamy came to be, or that I didn't have information about the discrepancies between the Book of Commandments and the D&C, or
Yeah,
that I didn't learn how the narrative of priesthood restoration came to be. Like I had the film strip and later a video, the restoration of the priesthood video that told the dominant narrative that, you know, all of the priesthood was restored before April 6, 1830, and everybody knew about it. And everybody knew what the Melchizedek priesthood was. Like, I never learned that that narrative wasn't developed until maybe 1834. Um, I didn't learn how problematic and messy that was. I didn't learn that a guy named Lyman uh, ordained Joseph to the high priesthood. He was a Campbellite minister in 1831, which doesn't make any sense whatsoever under the polished dominant narratives. So um, when I originally stumbled across the essays, what I initially believed is that the brethren knew at least some of this information, and then they chose to withhold it to protect heritage and faith. Number one, because that's how the discipline of history was practiced before, you know, the later 1900s. And so that's what they expected. But number two, it was a defensive posture to protect the church, to not feed information to critics. And when I read, as I was deconstructing, I ended up reading Elder Packer's. I ended up getting the Greg Prince's biography of Leonard Arrington and read that. And I ended up reading Elder Packer's talk, "The Mantle is Far, Far Greater Than the Intellect."
I did a video on
And
that one.
yeah, yeah. And and I learned that Packer gave that talk probably with Leonard Arrington and Michael Quinn in the audience at BYU, and it was basically a public humiliation, and this is my understanding, and takedown of Leonard Arrington, Richard Bushman, and Michael Quinn for doing what they were doing in the church history department with Leonard Arrington as the church historian, uh, prior to uh, basically Leonard Arrington being released from that calling without any. Normally, when you release someone, you notify everybody that you're released and you give a vote of thanks, like in a conference or something. And it was a pretty humiliating thing for Leonard Arrington. Um, and in that talk, "In the Mantle is Far, Far Greater Than the Intellect," Packer expresses that the role of the historian, he says historians idolize the truth, right? And he says something like
But
the truth is sometimes not very useful. And then he
yeah,
compares what
truth
he
doesn't always
thinks.
build up or edify or
Yeah,
uplift.
exactly. And what he expresses in that talk is that historians should parse and polish narratives. He didn't use these words, but that's what he was expressing, in the way that a defense attorney would do that for one of their clients. So rather than the discipline of history being honesty, transparency, let's figure out what happened and learn from it, it was the role of the historian was to present a polished narrative that protected heritage and faith.
Yeah.
And when I read that, number one, that so much violated my conscience and my core moral values. Like that, you should trust the members of the church with information, right? But there was a certain level of presentism in that Packer and the older people, they grew up in a system or with a culture where historians didn't do transparent scholarship. And it was the role of the historian was to present polished narratives. Um, but I was really angry uh, that the brethren, including brethren that I trusted, like President Hinckley, chose to give me materials that I would go teach on a mission, or the correlation committee, committee would give me materials that I would choose, that I would teach in elders quorum, high priest group, in Sunday school, and as a missionary. That at least some people, and I perceived some of the brethren at least, knowingly knew that the information was partially or entirely inaccurate, but they did that to protect faith. And to me, that felt like spiritual abuse, to give a narrative to someone, to have them go teach, to tell them when they experienced spirit, that means that it's objectively true and you can trust it, with them knowing that the narrative wasn't entirely transparent. That felt like spiritual abuse to me.
Mm.
And so I was very, very angry. I was angry at myself, betrayed by myself, very angry at the church and the brethren, felt betrayed by them. When I would go to apologists and say, help me understand this, more often than not, I was met with ridicule and
Almost
and
like blame reversal.
blame.
I totally resonate with you that I felt similar feelings of betrayal and that the church wasn't fully forthright and transparent in their history. And there's some apologists that would say, oh well, there are some quotes that allude to the seer stone, or the multiple first vision accounts have been published from the 1960s, or there's dialogue in Sunstone and Roughstone Rolling, all this scholarship, and you just didn't go reading it.
Yeah, you were lazy. Yeah, either that
Yeah,
or it was common knowledge. And my parents joined the church in 1969, right? I grew up with Bruce R. McConkie Mormonism, with Mormon doctrine,
yeah, me too.
what we would, you know, and so I had no idea that such a thing as BYU studies or dialogue or Sunstone existed. When I
Yeah,
learned
I
that
never heard of it.
Sunstone, yeah, when I learned that Sunstone existed, it's when they read the letter from the pulpit discouraging members from attending symposia, which meant Sunstone. They didn't say Sunstone. So I read the newspaper to find out what are they talking about, and found out that there was such a thing as Sunstone. I didn't know that it existed. And the idea that in 1972 or 74 there was like a New Era article, about something, uh, or some other obscure thing that said, there are multiple versions of the first vision, but didn't actually print the text of those versions. There's absolutely, in my mind, still no reason why. Well, I understand the reason, but in my mind, there was no valid reason as to why the different versions of the first vision didn't show up in Truth Restored or Our Heritage, so that when I
Yeah,
was teaching gospel doctrine, that we could have read them, right? You know, there wasn't only not the text, there was no reference to them. At least there could have been a reference, but I think they should have included the versions in those supplementary materials. There's no reason that they couldn't. So when I was seeking for help and I went to the apologists, what I found was not any sort of ministering whatsoever. Uh, but it was, I would call it gaslighting and polemic attacks on my character, that either I'm lying or that I was lazy. And I wasn't lazy. I was totally committed to the church, right? I would have
yeah,
given anything to the church. I planned my life so I could retire in my 50s and serve missions for the church for the rest of my life. I was totally committed. And I just, how would I know? Like I was a poor
Yeah. You don't
kid.
know what you don't know.
Yeah, I was a poor kid growing up. My parents divorced. We lived in a little farm shack of a house with a wooden foundation, and we felt grateful that we only had to rely on the church for help with just food. I mowed lawns and delivered pizza. My mom did sewing and alterations out of the home. How would have I known that I could subscribe to dialogue? You know, there was no
Yeah.
internet, you know, and so I was very, very, very upset. But as I was deconstructing, a friend, still a good friend by the name of Brian Whitney, he worked. He teaches school now. I think he lives in Brigham City, Utah. Um, he worked in the church history department as some of the essays were being prepared. Um, and he gave me some inside information on, what happened as the essays were being prepared, including the race and the priesthood essay. And uh, in any event, what he shared with me was this concept or understanding of how the discipline of history used to be done and how the church kind of got behind on what history meant, and that eventually it caught up to them. And so he wrote a good blog post. I think it's on the blog Worlds Without End. And in the blog post, he wrote, "We should stop saying they lied about history." And then he goes through and he explains how Joseph Fielding Smith was, uh, I think, the grandson of Hiram Smith,
Aaron Smith. Yeah.
and he was very literalist. The Hiram descendants, I understand, are very literalist, tending to
Yeah.
being believers,
Fundamentalist.
fundamentalists, and so he was very protective of the church, and he certainly came from a standpoint that the discipline of history was to included to protect heritage and to protect the church from the critics. And so to hold some grace for how Joseph Fielding Smith dealt with, like, the 1832 account of the first vision and potentially other documents that we don't know about potentially. Um, but that's the framework, that's the conceptual framework that they were coming from. And so to hold a little bit of grace, that even though I sensed a great betrayal, they were coming from a standpoint that they felt like they were doing what God wanted them to do,
Yeah.
because that's how history was done. And then you've got leaders of the church like Elder Packer, who a lot of people felt like was authority on things of this type, who in the talk, The Mantle is Far, Far Greater Than the Internet Intellect, um, perpetuated this idea or narrative that the role of the historian is to protect faith and heritage.
Yeah.
So yes, significant sense of betrayal, lots of anger, lots of grief. But over time, what helped me was to realize or to learn more about the motivations behind what they did. It still violated my core values. Like I wouldn't
Yeah.
have been okay
Sure.
with it.
And I agree with
But to
you
understand where
on
they're
that.
coming from.
Yeah, because whenever I think back to when I first was in my faith crisis, similar to you, I felt betrayal. I felt like they've just lied about the history, they've whitewashed things, and I sort of saw the leaders, the prophets and apostles, as sort of frauds, intentionally with sinister motives doing this. And over time, and with my reconstructing, coming back to faith, I extended more grace in that they, I think, with good intent, whether I don't agree with whitewashing history, and I believe transparency, similar to you, is important, and we should know the good, the bad, and the ugly, if it's faith promoting or not. We should be transparent, even if it doesn't build faith, because ultimately it's better for people to know the truth. But I can understand why they would want to not emphasize things that might harm faith, because they want to protect people's faith, because they ultimately believe that it's true. And I can even extend grace that maybe Joseph Fielding Smith didn't believe the Seerstone accounts were credible, and maybe dismiss them as erroneous, and you can extend some grace, not justifying it, but it can help you to heal and not feel the same betrayal.
Yeah, I mean, victim is the wrong word, but they're certainly products of the same system that we were a part of, and
Yes.
or that you're a part of now, and part of that system is a significant part of participation is belief affirmation. uh you go to Sunday school and talk about what we all believe. You don't go to Sunday school to learn about the documentary hypothesis or the synoptic problem. uh
Really? We learn about that every time in Ireland.
yeah. Whoops. I was apparently I was not in the promised land. uh
Although we have a Sunday school teacher in my ward, and kudos to her. She really does go above and beyond her lessons because, like, most of the time, Sunday school is just the same old questions, talk about the stories. And she was, tying in a wee bit of like, scholarship and talking about like the Greek. And I was like, this is actually I actually learned some things from
yeah,
her lessons. So
yeah,
kudos to her. But yeah, it's not like that
yeah,
in most wards.
yeah. And so certainly I appreciated when either I had the opportunity to bring things in when I taught or when other people did it. Um, uh, but my sense is that, a lot of times former believers, uh, they accuse the brethren of like participating in a conspiracy and that they don't really believe it.
Yeah,
And, Grant Palmer, uh, in his book, suggests that they know it's not true, and that it took Elder Uchtdorf a little bit longer than the rest of them to realize that it wasn't true. But
I think that heavily influenced my view because his book and a lot of Grant Palmer was a big thing that caused me to lose my faith the first time, as
yeah,
well as other critics.
yeah. My sense is that I think they believe that it's true. Uh, they know that they have. I think I don't believe any of them has seen Jesus, other than maybe a dream or something.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think they know that when they talk in veiled language to try to suggest to believers, members of the church, that they have been visited by Jesus or seen him or something, to me, that is dishonest. But I do believe and hold grace that they believe that that is what God would have them do, and they probably do believe that what they've experienced is representative of reality.
Yeah,
Uh,
have their own spiritual experiences and
yeah,
um,
yeah.
yeah,
So until you know, for someone like me or somebody like you that has gone through a faith crisis, there what it tends to do is result in more epistemic humility. I mean, hopefully it does. I mean, some people
yeah,
stay really black and white thinking, but hopefully it leads to work that increases epistemic humility, and being open to the idea that some of the truth cart, Patrick Mason in his Fair Mormon talk referred to the truth cart that was overloaded. Some of the things in the truth cart don't belong in there. My sense is until you had three or four of the most senior members of the Quorum of the 15 go through some level of faith transition or faith crisis, that there's nothing materially that's going to change uh, in terms of introducing more nuance to the system. And you know, I think we see some of that from Elder Uchtdorf. Sometimes we see more nuance than other times from him.
sure.
I think sometimes we see that with Elder Holland. Sometimes he'll give a talk about, all the seats in the choir and things
Yeah,
like
try to be
that,
more inclusive and
more
prophets
inclusive.
can make
Yeah,
mistakes and they've done things not in harmony with church policy or even
yeah,
doctrine. And
yeah. But then other times, then he'll double down on the more, you have to go over, or through the Book of Mormon or other kinds of literalistic things, and so, are some of the Quorum of the 15, have they experienced some shifts in the level of literalist beliefs that they had during their life? It's possible. Um,
Surely
uh,
now they're aware of a lot, they would have read through the gospel topics essays. They'd be aware
yeah,
of probably many of the things that's causing people to lose faith and go through a faith crisis. They may not be aware of all, everything in scholarship and all the criticisms, but I'm sure aware of quite a lot of them.
yeah, yeah. Was it Christofferson that quoted N.T. Wright? I can't remember. One of them quoted N.T. Wright in the most recent conference. Christofferson in the past has quoted David Bokovoy. I understand that before the Gospel Topics essays came out, there was a Faith Crisis report with chronicles that was prepared based on a survey that John Dehlin did with some others, and it was packaged and presented to then President Uchtdorf, by Marlin Jensen. And I understand that President Uchtdorf read all of those accounts of the chronicles and the Faith Crisis report, and that preceded that talk in October of 2013 of Come Join With Us, where he admits mistakes, and he says that it's just not a simple thing as to why people lose their belief. And it was a very
I remember that talk.
conciliatory talk. And my understanding is that that was after he read some of the difficult things. So, and I know Ron Rasband was one of my bishops when I was in grad school at University of Utah, and I think very highly of him. Um, but I know that Ron has been involved, or Elder Rasband has been involved, and interacted with much of the difficult information as well, because Hans Matzen, when he went through his faith crisis, counseled with Ron Rasband when Ron
Oh,
was in the first quorum of the 70. Um, and so they're aware of a lot of the things. And Brian Whitney, that I mentioned before, he explained that when the race and the priesthood essay, before it was published, it had to be unanimously approved by every single member of the Quorum of the 15. And the church history department published it to the website within minutes of that approval being voted on, in part because they were concerned that somebody might change their mind. So they just got
no.
it out there. So all of the Quorum of the 15, at the very least, have read and voted on the essays. Now, how much of like what we talked about in the last episode, do they understand about biblical scholarship and Deutero Isaiah, or the long ending of Mark, or that some of the letters attributed to Paul weren't actually written by him, you know, or the book Revelation in the New Testament wasn't a prophecy about today, but it was about what was happening at the time it was written. I have no idea how much of that stuff they know. My sense is that they probably don't know a lot of it.
Yeah,
Um, and
they're not scholars. They're not experts on many of these things.
yeah, yeah. Elder Ballard, uh,
Yes,
I
that just
think,
came to my mind.
is
Yeah,
referred to that like we're general authorities, and we go to scholars when we want to understand things.
yeah,
So, yeah, so there's a lot of people who experience significant sense of betrayal. I experienced it, you experienced it, and it's easy to point that to the brethren, and certainly there is some responsibility there.
yeah. I agree.
Um, but understanding how and why these things happen and the system that it's a part of was very helpful for me as I processed the grief and the sense of trauma of my faith crisis, and deconstructed church history and biblical scholarship, and eventually reconstructed meaning in my life.
That's awesome. Would you like to talk a little bit about, how you've navigated your mixed faith marriage with your wife? Obviously, you don't need to share anything that's too personal, but you've got a video about it, and also maybe other relationships, friends, other family members, and um, how you have navigated through, your differences in belief, and any advice to those people who are going through a faith crisis or who have lost their faith, and how they can interact with family members, friends in a way that doesn't have to impair the relationships.
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I would say um, among the first things that I would share with someone who's processing a faith crisis is it's helpful to understand what they're experiencing as grief. Um, and it's true that their countenance has changed because they're experiencing grief, and some of their believing friends and family are going to have the propensity to interpret your change of countenance as Satan, or as you being deceived, or as
Losing the
committing some
spirits.
great, yeah, losing the spirit. But what it is that you're experiencing grief, and you're experiencing a loss of trust, potentially an identity crisis in addition to a faith crisis. And it takes work and help from others to process severe grief. And there's something about grief in that people tend to believe that, maybe if grief encapsulates all of your being, that grief work is to process the grief so that over time it gets smaller and smaller and then it goes away. But that's not how grief work works. Um, Grief might start out encapsulating your being, but the way grief work works is that you put in work to expand the being that you are, so that the grief becomes a smaller and smaller relative percentage or component of the being that you are. And the
Hmm.
truth of the matter is the grief never actually ever fully goes away. It's our being grows and developmentally enlarges. There's a few things about that. Is some people get really upset when they get surprised by some new thing that triggers a new thing to unpack, a new thing to deconstruct, a new grief. But that's just part of the developmental process of deconstruction that's important as part of grief work. There's another thing about grief that's really important that I think it's helpful to understand, is that as people heal and grow and process the grief, and they expand the being that they are, in the future they can actually use that grief almost as a superpower, in that they can access it and interact with other people with an enhanced degree of empathy that they otherwise wouldn't be able to do, in a way that can really make a difference in the lives of others. So someone who has grief from a lost spouse, like that grief never fully goes, it doesn't go away. But as they grow and they heal and they move forward in their life, at times, if they encounter someone who's experiencing grief from the loss of a spouse, or a death of a child, they can access the grief of their experience, and exponentially enhance the sense of empathy and connection that they can provide to that
Yeah,
other
kind
person.
of like mourning with those who mourn.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And part of mourning with those who mourn is having things to mourn yourself, right?
yeah.
And
The
so,
one, like the one blessing, if I were to say, that's come from my faith crisis has been, I feel like I, I fully understand, or although people's faith crises are all different, I understand the pain and the issues that people wrestle with and the feelings they have that, in a way, I don't think I could understand had I have not gone through a faith crisis.
it's true.
It changes you.
I think there are some people who are active believing members of the church who, through a lot of work, have developed some capacity for empathy for those
Yes.
who've gone through a faith crisis, but it's kind of uncommon in my experience. Um, my good friend who was my stake president when I was going through my faith crisis, my good friend who was my bishop who I counseled with, they just couldn't even remotely conceptualize what I was experiencing, because neither of them had had an existential crisis, neither of them gone through a faith crisis, neither of them had in their lives experienced the depth of grief that I was traversing at the time. And so they did the best that they could. But what I needed to heal is I needed to find other people who could sit with me in my story, probably people who had gone through a similar process of grief themselves, whether it was a faith crisis or some other kind of grief. And Brene Brown talks about holding the hand of a stranger or ministering presence. In psychology, they call it active listening. But to sit with someone, to be with them, to validate their experience and their story, goes a very long way to helping people process trauma and grief. And that works in Alcoholics Anonymous. It works. There are like camps for children who have lost a parent or a sibling to death, that they go to a camp and they're around other people who have gone through, other kids who have gone through a similar experience. And that goes a long way towards their healing. And so, at least for me, for my experience, was the relief that I found and the healing and the growth came from going and participating in progressive and post-Mormon support groups. When I was in the midst of the dark night of the soul, the angry ones were too charged for me. Like
Mm.
ex-Mormon Reddit wasn't helpful for me. Mormon Stories podcast community on Facebook was too much for me. I found a group called, it's now called Waters of Mormon. It was called A Thoughtful Faith on
Mhm.
Facebook. And I was fortunate to uh, get a chance to visit with Lindsay Hansen Park when I was in the dark night of the soul. Uh, about 6 weeks into my faith crisis, she was visiting her best friend in Billings, Montana. Lindsay Hansen Park recorded the podcast Year of Polygamy, and she's the executive director now of Sunstone. And she had heard, hundreds, maybe thousands of stories like mine. But when I was 6 weeks into my dark night of the soul experience, and I couldn't find anyone that could help me, it just so happens that she was visiting her best friend here in Billings, and saw a post that I made in the what was the A Thoughtful Faith Facebook group. And she says, "No way, I'm in Billings. Like, we should go to breakfast together." And so, the next morning I met with her on a Friday morning, at a IHOP over pancakes, and shared my story with her. And the way she was able to empathize with and hold my story, that ministering presence, um, was huge. Like, it gave me relief from the dark night of the soul, at least temporarily. I didn't cry myself to sleep that night after meeting with her. So over time, participating in support communities was really helpful for me. So what I would suggest is that if someone is processing a faith crisis, to find people who can hold your story. And
Yeah.
there are going to be increasing numbers of people like you who are inside, who have gone through the experience, that can provide ministering and holding the hand of a stranger, metaphorically. Uh, when I went through it, I couldn't find anyone on the inside back 7 years ago in Billings, Montana, who could mentor me or sit with me in my experience. But I needed that to be able to process it and have confidence that there was light on the other side of my experience. Um, from the outside, my sense is members, families, and friends are going to perceive a shift in faith as very threatening. And
Yes.
yeah, because you're venting about something that they hold sacred, and that'll feel like a personal attack to them. And so that's not helpful. So it's generally not helpful to vent about the weeds of things to believers, because
It'll cause them to want to turn off and
yeah,
just see you as you're hostile, and they'll not want to listen when you're in that angry
yeah,
stage, and they can perceive. I remember whenever I first went through my fifth crisis and stepped away from church, and a lot of people you could sense were fearful about wanting. They didn't want to know You know, what's caused it? You know, maybe some did, but there's that fear. You know, of if I hear what they have to say, this could affect me, and it's almost like a poison. So stay away.
Yeah, in my ward back in 2016, I couldn't find anyone who had read the essays, and so I started just briefly asking about them at church, and and there were members of our ward that didn't believe that they were authorized, and they actually started referring to me as the apostate because I was asking for help and I was asking about the essays, and they did it to my face and they did it behind my back to the extent that it became toxic. I couldn't attend
Yeah.
anymore because I was in grief. I was asking for help. um, it's probable that I was speaking with emotionally charged language because I sensed betrayal, but I needed
That's
help.
normal. Yeah.
Yeah, I needed ministering, and it became toxic for me to attend.
Yeah.
And I hold grace for what they were experiencing, right? They didn't know that the essays were authorized. Many of them had never seen a faith crisis before, particularly of one of their leaders. Um, but uh, it was very, very unhelpful
And
and
you're probably bringing up questions and information that made them uncomfortable.
very
They've
uncomfortable.
had maybe hadn't heard of some of it before, and
Yeah. Oh, I believed a lot of the stuff in the essays had been anti-Mormon lies, right?
yes.
And so when I brought them up and said, "Hey, these are on the church's website," I mean, many of the people in my ward thought they were anti-Mormon lies.
Hmm.
Maybe the church's website got hacked, or like there were apostate people in the church history department that did this without the brethren's knowledge or something like that.
Hmm. No, I had a similar sort of reaction whenever I first learned from one of my family members their concerns with church history and Joseph Smith. And when they first started telling me things, I was like, no, there's no way this is true.
Right.
About the seer stone or polygamy or multiple accounts of the first vision. And then whenever I checked gospel topics essays, checked Fair Mormon, that's when I was like, oh, it's actually validating what I first thought were just anti-Mormon lies and told to stay
Yeah.
away from.
Yeah. So a lot of times when people are going through faith crisis, they want to unpack the weeds with their believing friends and family for a few reasons. One thing, I think that we want to feel validated,
Yes.
validate my pain, right? And so we like word vomit all over them, kind of thing. The weeds,
Yeah.
emotionally charged.
Regurgitate the CS letter.
Right. Yeah. Not helpful. Um, the other thing is maybe we think, well, maybe I can find somebody else who knows about this and they have a satisfying answer or satisfying reconciliations to these things. So maybe
Mhm.
we share for that reason. Um, Sometimes we want to feel validated, like, um, uh, you need to know this and I'm going to take you out of the church, which is unhelpful. Like, I think people are going
Yeah.
to unpack when they're ready to unpack. It's not helpful to try to crash their shelves.
No.
um so
And I find, and we can touch on this maybe in a wee bit, but I find with my own family members or my wife's complete TBM. I don't want to talk too much about her, but there's been times in my faith journey, even since coming back, where I've had frustrations, issues, and doubts, and there's times where I've been emotional, sharing with her my issues or concerns, and it's done more harm than good. And the times where I've discussed with her a particular topic in a way that's almost like just giving the almost like in a robotic way, just the here's the issue, here's maybe what apologists say, here's what critics might say, and that's sort of it, and not trying to get emotional about it. And if she asks like, "Oh, what's your episode about?" and I found that a more productive conversation because they've not felt threatened or attacked in the way that I've shared sort of a topic or issue.
yeah, it's hard to do when you're raging.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So anyway, I think it's helpful for people to deconstruct uh with individuals that it's helpful to deconstruct with, and that's usually not going to be the believers. And of course on the inside they're going to go, you're just rehearsing your doubts with all these other people, that are all raging. But part of processing grief and trauma is the deconstruction process. Like if you just try to skip it, it's going to fester. Like eventually it's going to show itself someday.
Yeah.
If you try to reconstruct a bunch of shelves, like there's a high probability those shelves are going to crash again, rather than just dealing with the ambiguity and dealing with things with more epistemic humility. So I would say there are a couple of things that are super helpful. One is David Osler wrote a book called Bridges. He's a data scientist who's since retired. He's been a bishop, stake president, mission
Yeah.
president, and he's probably one of the few active believing members of the church who hasn't gone through a faith crisis, who understands faith crisis. And his book is fantastic. I've bought multiple copies and I give them out as gifts. You know, if people, I say to, like I said to my stake president, I'm like, I have a gift for you. It's a book. It's distributed through Deseret Book. It's from David Osler. It's called Bridges. If I gave it to you as a gift, would you read it? And he said yes. So I gave it to him as a gift, and he read it. And I think that was helpful. So that's good. John Ogden has a book called When Mormons Doubt that's really helpful. And my friend Chris Kimball recently wrote a book called Living on the Inside of the Edge that I also think is very helpful. My friend Rob Terry, he used to go by Randall Bowen as a pseudonym, but his name is Rob Terry. He has a blog called Church is True and did a podcast series, a Church is True podcast series, where he goes through CS letter kinds of topics and explains how he reconciles them still as a nuanced believer in the church.
Mhm.
So, I mean, those are some things that could be resources for believers. Um,
I think they're also good ways to, as believers, to have more understanding. That's one sort of side motivation for my channel, what I'm doing. One is to really confront, navigate my way through, but for people to have more understanding towards the issues, awareness of some of these controversial things in church history or things that the church's truth claims, but to maybe have understanding towards critics or those people who lose their faith, and to see, I can actually understand why they might come to this conclusion. I might come to a different one, but I can understand why they've left, why they no longer believe.
yeah, I mean, certainly there are apologists of the church who know the information and maybe they even agree with me on a lot of the biblical scholarship, and they can appreciate, empathize, and understand why I would come to the conclusions that I do, even though they come to a different conclusion, engaging with all the material.
Yeah.
Yeah, and those kinds of apologists, the interaction with them has been helpful. And then there are
Hmm.
other apologists that have the more polemic tone, like, you're looking at this as a childish way, you were just lazy, that kind of a personal attack thing. Totally
Yeah.
not helpful.
No.
Um,
It just well, you can share your thoughts, but I think it just provokes people. It creates more divisions, less understanding, less empathy. It creates that us versus them mentality, this polarization, and
yeah,
often what I've seen as well is you try to personally attack the person. If you say things like, "Oh, they've been deceived, they're apostate, they've been overcome by Satan, and you can do all these things to just dismiss and discredit them. So you don't
mhm.
have to acknowledge or confront what are they saying, what are their arguments, what are their reasons. And I think it doesn't promote understanding, and I don't think it's good for especially relationships, like if it's family members, friends, and that happens, and it's really sad. I've been very fortunate that me and my family members have still been able to have good relationships despite our differences. But it's a pity that that happens and the lack of respect and understanding.
Yeah, I don't know if it started with Hugh Nibley, but certainly it's a common approach in traditional apologetics to kind of ridicule people who have questions and
Oh yeah.
personally attack a critic or a doubter. Um, and so I think where there are apologists that choose that approach, maybe it's because that's been modeled to them. I'm not quite sure um, where they come up with the idea that that could be helpful. Um, and then there are apologists like Patrick Mason, who, and there are others like him who hold a
Like
lot of space.
Evans. Yeah.
Yeah, like the Gibbons, who hold a lot of space, for people, even if they disagree with them, but do it without ridiculing. Uh, or gaslighting is probably an overused term, but it does happen. Like, no,
Mhm.
we never taught that. I'm like, what? Yeah,
Yeah,
yes, we did
yeah.
taught that. Teach that
And
kind of
and I've
thing.
noticed that at times with apologists, and I resonate more with people who have left because of my experience with the faith crisis as well. And I've seen that as well at times, gaslighting from some apologists or trying to blame critics or ex-members. And one of the things that's been actually really nice about some of the interviews I've conducted is I've had some people like Brian Hales or Stephen Harper almost validate the questions I've been asking. Like these are really good, thoughtful questions, and they're really no different to questions that critics would raise. Maybe it's the way I ask them, but I think it's acknowledging that some of these questions, these are good, important questions, important issues,
Yeah.
and they need to be considered and valued. And you shouldn't attack the person, no matter what their motives are. But look at the question that they're asking, and most of the time it's because they're hurting or they really are trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with that, but I also would hold grace that some of these people just get barraged. Some of these apologists get barraged with people acting in bad faith, or when they're in the
Yes,
really emotionally charged stage over and over and over and over again. So it's
and
really
they've
hard.
probably heard it so many times as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm
It's
not naive to that. There are people that would have probably not bad, bad motives, intent. But
yeah.
I think for the most part, I like to give people the benefit of the doubt and that they're probably trying to act in good faith and
Yeah.
sincere
Yeah.
questions they're wrestling with. But I think sometimes you
Yeah.
can decipher those who just want to bash and attack and ridicule versus those who, like, since doing my chat, I've had people reach out to me with really tough questions, concerns, issues, similar ones that I've had, and you can see that they're just desperately wanting help or validation or
Yeah.
solution.
But if you're one of those, here I am defending, or at least holding grace for some of the traditional apologists that do the most unhelpful thing. How do you discern? How do you discern when someone comes to you with an emotionally charged question, whether it's in good faith or bad faith? Like, I don't. And
In
when you get so many, how do you discern? How do you know that? I don't know. I
in
don't
my
like
view,
how
I
they
think
respond, but I have grace that they probably don't have the ability to discern.
And in my view, I personally feel like whether or not I may think that they're acting in good faith or not, or sincere or not, I feel like if you're following Jesus, you shouldn't judge or condemn and just give people the benefit of the doubt that they're acting in good faith. And especially if you know that it's a valid question. If it's not a great question, then provide the answer. But I think everyone's questions should be respected and acknowledged, and if you
Yeah.
have information to counter it, then I think you present it in a way that's kind and respectful and validating.
Yeah. Well, I'm on Team Murph then, because I agree with you.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah. So a person going through a faith transition, they're they're going to want to deconstruct. That's very helpful. It's part of the process. Don't let it overwhelm your life. Look for people who can minister to you, who can, hold the hand of a stranger thing. Um, Realize that this is a developmental journey. Learn about uh, faith development. Read Brian McLaren's Faith After Doubt. Learn about Fowler's Stages of Faith.
Yeah.
Realize that this is a developmental process. It's actually a helpful thing. We can be better. We can hold more grace for people. We can hold more nuance, and grow forward. There are local support groups across the world, uh, and usually they tend to show up in places where there are a lot of members of the church, because then there are more former believers of the church. But you can
Hmm.
find them on mormonspectrum.org. You can find them on Thrive Beyond Religion. I think that's a .org too. They have in-person maps. You can go to the Salt Lake City Sunstone Symposium and go to some of the breakout sessions that talk about communicating across faith and belief, or living on the liminal or outside edge of your community, either inside or outside the edge, things like that, that can be helpful. But hold some grace for yourself and realize that this is a developmental process that's going to take time. And a lot of times, my sense is you're not going to find, some people will, but I think most people aren't going to find satisfying answers that put them exactly back in the level of orthodox literalist belief that they had before.
Hmm. Yeah.
They might find satisfying answers, or they might not, that help them at some point move forward in their own developmental journey.
Yeah.
So a few things I shared with you, and you're going to share that episode on my podcast, where I shared the video that I did with my wife, but I wanted to touch on a few of those things, if that's okay.
Yeah. Go for it.
So, so one thing that I would share, and my wife would be okay with this. One thing that my wife and I learned is that we grew up with very different versions of Mormonism. So
Hmm.
my parents converted to the church in 1969 when I was 3 years old, and I grew up with very, Benson, Hinckley, Packer, McConkie Mormonism. I went to Cleon Skousen workshops that, were almost John Bircher political and Constitution, divine scripture related and so forth. So that's the version of Mormonism that I grew up with. In our local Mormon Spectrum group, we have a couple in their late 60s who are in our group, and they grew up with David O. McKay Mormonism. And I'm like, tell me about that. And they said, well, under David O. McKay, uh, there were no worthiness interviews. The bishop was kind of the father of the ward, and it was just kind of a community. And our criticism of Catholics were, you have to go through your priest to like confess and access God. We don't have to do that in our church. Like, we don't have to go to our bishop to confess. Like, we just repent to God, right? That
Right.
was the version of
Under
Mormonism that
David O.
they,
McKay.
under David O. McKay. It
Oh, I
was
didn't know that.
yeah, it was. And then after David O. McKay, it was a huge shift to Joseph Fielding Smith Mormonism,
Hmm.
right? And and then we had a series of others that tended to be more literalistic. Maybe Spencer Kimball was less than Ezra Taft Benson, but overall it was way more structured, more
Yeah.
literalistic. And so this couple explained that they grew up as David O. McKay Mormons. So when the church shifted to Joseph Fielding Smith, Harold B. Lee, Ezra Taft Benson, Spencer W. Kimball Mormonism, they nuanced it. They didn't totally buy into it. And they stayed in the church until, when I was serving as high priest group leader, they left the ward. I thought it was my fault, but it wasn't. It didn't work for them to be in the church anymore. But they explained that they had a very different version of Mormonism. So I went home to my wife and I'm like, let me share with you what our friends shared about David O. McKay Mormonism. And my wife shared with me, oh, yeah, I totally am a David O. McKay Mormon. I'm like, what? How could you be a David O. McKay Mormon? And she says, well, my parents were David O. McKay Mormons, and they raised me as a David O. McKay Mormon. Like,
Yeah.
they probably didn't have a copy of McConkie's Mormon Doctrine in their home. They probably didn't. And the way they engaged with General Conference was different than the way I engaged with General Conference. So my wife and I were in a mixed faith marriage even before my faith crisis, and I didn't totally realize it.
Yeah,
And
you have different yeah, like the way you view like prophet, scripture, doctrine, because I've seen that as well, like with my wife and the way I would have viewed, scripture and revelation so direct, so literalistic. A prophet can never lead you astray. A prophet can't teach false doctrine, or
yeah,
there can't be discrepancies or contradictions in scripture. Like that can't
Yeah.
happen. Or
Yeah.
Revelation is super direct, God speaking to them, and she's like,
Yeah.
"What? You think God's actually literally speaking to them? Like, that doesn't happen like that. Like what? Like what sort of Mormonism did you
What
grow up?"
church are you in? Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. So one thing that I've really learned as I've gone through this whole process is there are many different versions of Mormonism that people grew up with, and how people react to difficult information, disconfirming information, and faith crisis is significantly affected by the version of Mormonism with which they grew up and the
yeah,
things that they were exposed to, on top of how they're built as individuals. Like, are they analytical? Do they think linearly or abstractly? Like, how are they built affects their
yeah.
experience, but also how the version of Mormonism with
The
which
black and
they were
white thinking.
raised.
Hmm.
Yeah. So a lot of times I find that the more literalist believers that had the more brittle box of what Mormonism meant tend to be the ones more likely to experience a more acute faith crisis. And
Yeah,
then we have a propensity to impute to the believers who haven't gone through a faith crisis that their version of Mormonism is the same box that ours was, that was brittle
yeah,
and crumbled on us. And and like you were talking about with your wife, that tends to cause issues in relationships when people are going through their faith crisis, because everybody assumes that their version of Mormonism, not everyone, but a lot of us assume that our version of Mormonism is the
right
version
one. Yeah.
of Mormonism, right?
Mine's the real Mormonism.
Yeah,
Not
right.
this
And
distorted version you have.
yeah, yeah. All right, so I'm going to share the thing that some of the things from the video that I did about our mixed faith marriage. One of the suggestions that I received when I was early in my faith crisis is to double and triple down on attentive, undemanded expressions of love and emotional intimacy to my wife in her primary love language. This was difficult to do when I was processing grief, but I did it. And it proved very helpful because our marital relationship and our connection got stronger and it grew. And it was helpful for my wife so that she could experience it as I was incrementally stepping away from belief in the church, that I wasn't stepping away from her because she felt the emotional connection. It also increased her capacity to distinguish our marriage from our ceiling, so that our marriage was an independent emotional intimacy and connection, separate of how I viewed the ceiling that we had. At the same time, it was helpful for me because while I was unpacking and deconstructing church history and sometimes felt betrayed and a sense of anger, increased my capacity to distinguish her from the church, so that I wasn't imputing my sense of frustration on the church on her because she chose to be active in the
Yes.
church. Yeah. So sometimes when a person experiences a faith transition, there's a diminishment of emotional intimacy and trust with believing spouse, family, friends. Um, and so one of my suggestions from my personal experience is to put in significant work to nourish that intimacy with family, spouse, and friends on the relationships that matter to you.
Because
Um,
you feel that betrayal towards the church, and they can also feel some betrayal towards the person who might lose their faith, and they're processing their own grief.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, so my wife's processing her own grief that, she was sure that I was going to resign from the church right away. It took me almost 2 years to make that decision, but she was sure I was going to resign right away. So she felt grief and betrayal as well as I was going through my faith crisis. So investing in attentive expressions of emotional intimacy to nourish that relationship has been critical to our mixed faith relationship. And I would recommend that people processing a faith crisis do the same thing where they have mixed faith relationships. It'll be helpful for them as the person who's going through faith transition. It'll be helpful for the believers as well.
Yeah.
So the second thing is to use a spiritual values exercise or some other method to identify common and differentiated spiritual values, preferences, and interests. And
Mm.
so my wife and I found that for us, we enjoy things like listening to the On Being podcast with Krista Tippett, books from Brene Brown, things about the secular application of Buddhist principles from Jack Kornfield and Eckhart Tolle, things about faith and growth like Brian McLaren's book Faith After Doubt, and he has a podcast too. Um, and so um, it's to find things that we can nourish together and experience spirit, connection, love, peace, joy, and transcendent connection together, while also realizing that we each have differentiated things that fill us. And so by nourishing the together things, then the believer might experience spirit when they're around the faith transitioner and feel less threatened because they experience spirit, even though the
Yeah.
person's going through a faith transition. And it's going to help the faith transitioner to experience and manifest what you would call the fruits of the spirit, or spiritual values at the same time.
Like love and goodness and kindness, and focusing more on your commonalities and spiritual values than
Yeah,
focusing on your differences.
yeah. And trusting that we each have things that feed us different separately, that are differentiated, but we do have things that we share together. So one of the things that my wife and I did when I was in the early stages of my faith crisis, about a year or so into it, is there was a woman that had been a longtime friend. Her husband was in a nursing home. Her daughter is the same age as our son, and she's disabled. And they lived in like it might have been a 1954 or 56 mobile home, like way out on the edge of town, and it was falling apart. When I was high priest group leader, we would go and do repairs to, because it would leak, or it was so old that it, if the wind blew too much, it like maybe would torque a little bit. So if they opened the window, they couldn't get it closed. It was a mess. And so one thing that my wife and I did is we decided to do is we created an irrevocable trust, and we raised a little bit more than $26,000 from believers, from non-believers. I got a former Relief Society president to be a co-trustee with the woman's home teacher of the trust, and we raised money and we bought a replacement trailer home for a lot newer, like early 2000s, bigger, more energy efficient. I got um, I got volunteers to do electrical work, to do the dirt work, to crush and haul off and salvage the old trailer and so forth. It was a very meaningful experience to us. It was something that that my wife and I could do and share together as a shared spiritual activity to try to make a difference in the life of this woman and her disabled adult daughter. And as well as it allowed me to engage with my believing friends in a way that was not threatening to them.
Yeah.
Maybe there were a few that stopped calling me the apostate, and participated in that and helped me with the move, helped me stage what was in the house into my enclosed trailer while we were all doing the dirt work and stuff, and help me go in and clean the new trailer so it was ready to move in. So that would be an example of a shared spiritual language that my wife and I shared together that was very meaningful for us, but we also were able to include believing members and former members in the community in that effort.
That's awesome.
So thanks. So the third thing is I share, think of black licorice as a metaphor. So my wife loves black licorice and I can't stand it. I
I'm
hate
with you there.
yeah, right.
They're
Yeah,
all
people either love it or they don't. And I explain that neither of us experience any sort of emotional or spiritual turmoil or pain over our differentiated preferences for black licorice. Like I'm not, it's not painful that my wife likes black licorice, right?
Mm,
And it's not painful to her that I don't. And so then I say, of course, there are beliefs that we individually hold as human beings where we enmesh and entangle with our individual egos and our personal senses of identity that go way beyond preferences like black licorice.
yeah.
And it can be painful to disentangle and differentiate in those things. But I say in the end, and this is kind of a Buddhist thinking idea, these things are all just black licorice. They're preferences. They're things that we find helpful that maybe somebody else doesn't. And so if we can find and nourish and develop intimacy, relationship, trust, and belonging in things outside black licorice, that maybe we can increase our capacity to choose for it to be okay that our spouse likes black licorice,
Yeah.
metaphorically or literally. So in a mixed faith relationship, sometimes it's painful for them if we don't believe in that the temple ceiling is a real thing, and maybe we have a hard time that they don't believe that transparency in church history is an important thing, and we get all upset about it. But in the end, these are personal preferences. They're black licorice. So the next thing I suggest is to talk about your biggest and deepest fears with each other so that you can face them together rather than catastrophize them individually. So my wife shared with me that she was fearful that if I could change how I felt about the church, even though I deeply loved it and it was part of my very identity and being, that I could also all of a sudden shift how I felt about her. And
Right.
one thing that was a big concern for her was that she was fearful that as I developed emotional and spiritual intimacy with women who were on the same journey as me, like in support groups, uh, other people navigating faith crisis, she was fearful that there was a risk that she might lose me, that I would develop relationship or intimacy that would just go beyond a support group thing. So that was a fear of hers. But probably the biggest fears of hers was that as I renegotiated and reconstructed behavioral and moral boundaries, like what that it was okay to drink wine with dinner, you know, uh, or something like that. She was concerned that as I renegotiated and reconstructed moral and behavioral boundaries, that there could be problems for our marriage with regard to infidelity or problematic alcohol use, for example.
Right.
And sometimes we see that in the post-Mormon community where the rest of the world tests behavioral boundaries with regard to sexuality, for example, in maybe high school or college. A lot of people in the church community never test those behavioral boundaries. So they're like adolescents, at bay. And then they go through a faith crisis. And when they're in the midst of processing grief and trauma, then they also decide to test
I would
behavioral
explore.
boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All the things I
As
think
if
that's
they were
to do.
adolescents, but they're in their 30s, 40s, or 50s. And that can be a big problem. So that was a big fear for her. Actually, the biggest fear she wanted me to make sure that I explain was her fear was that I wouldn't have the capacity to hold space for her differentiated beliefs, and that if she didn't
Yeah.
follow me, that I would choose to not be with her. And my biggest fears were in many ways similar to hers, is that I was fearful that she might someday decide that she couldn't be with me anymore if I didn't believe in the truth claims of the church, or if I eventually chose to resign my membership. So it was helpful for us, instead of holding those fears individually and catastrophizing them and having that affect our depth of vulnerability, trust, and authenticity in our relationship, it's helpful to give words to those fears and talk about them. So we could
Yeah.
talk about establishing boundaries and talk about what our fears were and things like that.
That would
That
build
was
your connection, understanding, empathy, emotional intimacy during that time.
100%. Yes. It was vital to our relationship.
Yeah.
So along the way, we each had to put in a significant amount of individual work so that we could have confidence that we would both be okay if either of us chose to not be in the marriage. So our original marriage was based on a commitment to each other and to God. When my conceptualization about it having something to do with God shifted, um, uh, we found ourselves renegotiating what our marriage was. Like, why are we married? Like,
Yeah.
and sometimes it ends in divorce. That renegotiation. With ours, we decided and we chose that we really wanted to be together. But part of that process was having it be a choice where we each felt like we had the individual autonomy, and that we would each be okay if either of us decided to end the marriage, that we would be okay. So we sat down and talked about, if we decided to get a divorce, how would we divide assets? How would we divide income? What would we do and what we would do next? And we both needed to have that discussion, number one, so we didn't have to worry about it anymore. But number two, so that we could both approach the relationship as individual autonomous people choosing to be together. And that was really important. So there was another thing that was very significant, probably a biggest inflection point to our mixed faith marriage. And this is kind of a Buddhist principle in terms of living with ambiguity and uncertainty. But there are things that are not okay for me, and there are things that are not okay for her. So I'm an extrovert. I want to go out and try to help people. I just want to try to make a difference in the world. And I talk about my faith transition publicly, right? My wife is very much a private person. She's an introvert. Uh, and she doesn't want me to tell her story. So I only share as much as what she's told me is okay. So
Yeah.
it's never going to be okay for her that I'm out here doing a podcast with you.
Yeah.
Uh, right. And it's never going to be okay for me that she's made a conscious choice to not go deeper than studying the gospel topics essays. She's chosen not to study biblical scholarship. She's chosen to not to unpack more than just the essays.
Yeah.
Um, that's never going to be okay to me, because I don't feel like I'm fully validated or understood in my experience, because she doesn't go study what was significant to my experience. But the Buddhist idea is that we have made a choice that it's okay that not okay things exist, because we want to be together. And if she was holding out on this idea that at some point I wouldn't talk about this stuff, or if I was holding out on this idea that at some point she would study biblical scholarship or something, it just wasn't going to be helpful. Like we
No.
needed to be able to choose for it to be okay that not okay things exist. And once we acknowledged this individual autonomy and choice that we had each made, and we clearly communicate boundaries to each other, that we nourish shared spiritual languages, and that we've made a choice for it to be okay that not okay things exist, that has been foundational to our marriage. And we've been married for 32 years, and we would both tell you that our marriage is better than it's ever been. And I don't know that these things would have ever happened if I hadn't gone through my faith transition.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's forced you
and
to have to work through these things, work through these challenges and your differences. And
yeah,
yeah, sometimes pain and struggle can make things stronger.
it can. These things don't work for everyone. My sense is that a faith crisis, whether it's a mixed faith marriage or not, a faith crisis reveals the underlying marriage that was there,
Yes.
that was tied together based on what the belief constructs were. And once those beliefs constructs crumble, then it reveals what the underlying marriage is,
Yeah. What foundation
including
there?
including dysfunctions and things like that. And sometimes that can result in putting in work so that the marriage is better and stronger. And sometimes it results in a choice for one or both partners to end the marriage. And sometimes that's a better thing for them too.
Yeah.
Um, but my sense, it is helpful to put in the work rather than to think, oh, yeah, we have dysfunctions in our marriage, but that'll work itself out in the next life. We can just like ignore that stuff now, right? And
Yeah,
that
that's,
doesn't
that's not a
work.
healthy or wise
No,
approach.
no. Eventually that catches up with people.
Yeah.
So these kinds of principles, shared spiritual languages, being okay with not okay things existing, uh, those kinds of things, these principles apply to other mixed faith relationships. So
Yeah.
these things, like,
Siblings, friends,
yeah,
father and
yeah,
son, or yeah, mother, daughter, whatever it
yeah,
be.
yeah, yeah. So definitely that's the case. I recently joined a book club locally, and half of the men in the book club are believing members and half are people like me. And and those who are like me aren't in the angry stage or burn it down stage anymore. Like we've gone through the deconstruction, we're reconstructing meaning. But it's been really enjoyable to reconnect with some of these believing friends where we pick a book to read each month, and then we get together and talk about it. Last month we read the book When Breath Becomes Air. uh, uh, it's a really popular book about a physician that got cancer and ended up dying, and what his experience was going through all of that.
Mhm.
Um, so that was a really helpful question. And I think I want to do more things with my believing friends and family, where we're not talking about the weeds of the church, but where we're talking about
Yeah,
shared things. And
because that
actually,
can just cause more a fraction and division, between relationships. If all you talk about is your differences and you bring up issues with the church and they get defensive, and it can cause bad feelings between each other. And if people are somehow able to have dialogue, have civil discussions, listen with love to someone's issues and do it in a way that's not attack of, those can be productive conversations. But sometimes you need to respect boundaries of, for example, with my wife just wouldn't be interested in some of the controversial things in church history like I am, or the things that bother me wouldn't bother her. And unless she asks, I have to respect her boundaries where she's at, and vice versa. She needs to respect that these things are important to me. And I think you've
yeah,
talked about that as well, and
yeah,
how
but
that
they're
happens.
shared things though too that you can
Yeah,
focus on, right?
yeah, focus on the commonalities, focus on, yeah, the things that you both find spiritually valuable, the same morals and values that you still hold to, and the things that you can do to grow and build together. I've noticed that there's some ex-Mormons who can sometimes be in this phase of angry, flippant, attack, almost, burn the church down. And it seems like they might stay in that approach where they maybe don't find healing. What would be your advice to them? And of course, there's not maybe one right way to reconstruct after a faith crisis, but I can't help but think that staying in that anger phase, I kind of compare it to a bad breakup. When you have a bad breakup, there's grief, you're hurt, you feel betrayed, but staying in that heartbroken, betrayed mindset and feeling that way long term can't be good. You almost have to heal from it. And I find that often you can look back and see like, okay, I can understand why I felt hurt and betrayal, but I can also see that some of the good in it as the emotions have gone away.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty tough question because everybody's journey is a little bit different. Some people get continually rewounded, right?
Yeah,
Um, Maybe because of the way they're treated by friends and family, or maybe they experience really significant trauma. Uh,
yeah, yeah.
like
Everyone's experiences are different. The faith crisis is
yeah,
different. It might
yeah,
trigger people more
yeah.
than others.
Yeah. So when I would say I would say to the person, I would say, anger, my understanding is anger is what burns the ground to prepare it for new growth. But eventually, once the ground is burnt, it's time to start figuring out what's next. But only the individual really is going to be able to figure out where that is in the process. Hopefully they're putting in work so that they're not re-traumatizing themselves, not re-wounding themselves, setting boundaries, whatever they need to do. Uh, but I would say a couple things. Number one is I would say the church is never going to go away. It,
Yeah,
it, there are always going to be people that are more fundamentalist, literalist type believing. They're going to be McConkie, Hinckley, Packer Mormons forever, most likely. You know, hundreds of years at least. Um, and so and there'll be nuanced members too. There'll be a spectrum. But But I would say if you spend your whole life trying to burn something down that will never burn down, and then you die, uh, uh, how do you feel about that? Like at
Life
some
well spent.
point, yeah, I tried to burn. I tried to tear down a wall that I was never able to tear down. Like at some point in the process, maybe shifting your energy towards something where at the end of your life you think, wow, I was really great. I was really grateful that I expended that amount of energy on that thing. uh you know I, I think people should have contemplative reflection about those kinds of things. And so are there some people like, Mike Norton, new name Noah, that does the videos and the temples and stuff like that? Like he very well may spend his entire life trying to burn it down.
Yeah, sort of mocking, belittling,
Yeah.
um, yeah, making fun just in a way to
Yeah.
attack and um, yeah, hurt other people and their beliefs.
Yeah.
I can
He very
understand, they see it as, a cult. We've been
Yeah.
lied and deceptions,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
the church deserves it.
Well, and the interesting thing is that the answer I think is both and, like it's complex. Like there are people who were probably suicidal LGBTQ people who or some other thing that stumbled across a Mike Norton temple video, and that led them to a faith transition so they didn't die by suicide, or something like
Yeah,
that. So there
yeah,
are probably some circumstances where what Mike did like saved someone's life, maybe even literally. Um, but on the other hand, like if he spends his whole life doing that, the church isn't going to go away. Um, my sense is that even if 2 dozen people in the church office building decided to violate their non-disclosure agreements and shared things about the internal workings of the church that would cause a lot of Mormons to have a shift in belief. There are a lot that it won't. And in the end, it's never going to go away. Like
yeah.
it's so wealthy, it's never going to go away. But there are people who receive benefits from their participation in the church sufficient that they might never go through a faith transition, and they'll always be believers of the church until the day they die.
Yeah,
And so I think that people just need to get self-reflective on, what's the purpose of what they're doing. Are they processing grief and trauma? Are they establishing boundaries? Are they re-traumatizing themselves or submitting themselves to circumstances where they're re-traumatized? And at the end of your life, or 10 or 20 years from now, when you look back, and all the energy that you're going to allocate, like what what are you going to be happy with? Like, because if you spend that life trying to burn it down, it's not going to burn down. So how good do you feel about expending all that energy to burn something down that's never gotten burned down? So that
that's such
probably
a good
sounds
point.
it probably sounds flippant to people who are in the midst of it.
Yeah,
um and I would have been upset about it too, because I had to burn it down period of time. um but in the end, I want to move forward. Like whether spirit is elevation motion, or whether it's God, or whether there's transcendent experiences that are just uniquely serendipitous, or that there's a divine component in them, I want to strive to manifest those things in my life.
yeah,
And I want to strive to that answer that I felt like I received on my mission, that the purpose of my life is to live with gratitude for the opportunity to participate in the lives of others. I want to do that. And so that's how I'm built. So that's what I'm doing. And I feel like it's helpful for each person to figure out, what is their thing? What are they going to do? And I
yeah.
would I don't want to be super prescriptive. I don't want to be prescriptive. I want people to decide for themselves what they're going to do post deconstruction. But if there was something that I would highly recommend, it's to strive to manifest the fruits of love, peace, joy, gratitude, grace, and connection, transcendence in their life.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And I think, what you said about it's very unproductive when you try to change the other person's mind to try to convince them. That never tends to go well. If anything, people dig their heels in stronger into what they believe and somehow get in the stage where you can have just civil dialogue, empathy, understanding, compassion, almost like putting down your weapons of war for a minute and seeing each
Yeah.
other as human beings and listening with love and to understand even if you're not going to agree. And I think talking about disagreements, talking about differences and concerns and issues, I think they're important. But I think trying to find a way, and I think with critics and apologists, believers and unbelievers, finding a way to have difficult conversations where you might disagree and might be controversial, but not being disagreeable, not being attackable. It's something that it's not easy, especially when people's beliefs are sacred and very personal to them, or people's issues and concerns bring a lot of betrayal and frustration and sadness. But I think trying to find ways to build bridges, not see each other as enemies, and be able to understand each other, I think is something that hopefully we can do better. I think that's something that I took from President Nelson's talk as well. And I'm hoping that, with individuals like you in the postmodern community, that you can be, I think, you're a good model of that, of respectful, kind, thoughtful dialogue, sharing your positions and helping people to understand why people lose their faith, what's that like for them, and how we can still maintain loving relationships that don't have to break because somebody stops believing in the church or somebody doesn't share the same belief. And I feel like if especially we're trying to follow and apply the teachings of Jesus, I feel like it shouldn't have to break break our relationships.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think it takes some level of nuance and a belief in grace. And, because the literal believer is going to say, uh, I've jeopardized my eternity. My wife will get reassigned as a plural wife to some other man in the eternities.
Yes,
And me expressing how my doubts or my concerns or how I've reconciled things is pulling people away from, you know, eternal life. Um, and I can understand where they're coming from.
sure. Yeah,
Um,
me too.
but if they can hold enough nuance, uh,
Maybe some
and
epistemic humility as well to their own
yeah, and
beliefs.
belief in grace um, that God can work with people inside and outside of the church, that people can experience spirit and grow inside and outside of the church, and that we have a role to play, and that, like in the parable of the laborers in the vineyard, uh, there's a reward for all the workers that are working
Yeah,
there.
and
And
it's not our place, I think, to label, malign, to demonize, label people as, critics or as apostates, they're deceived, Satan's got their heart. I can understand the very fundamentalist orthodox view. They may say, well, ultimately, if the church is what it claims to be, then, that can't be God or whatever leading you out. I can understand to an orthodox, but I don't think it's our place to judge another person's journey and what they're going through, and to just love them and be compassionate and try to listen with kindness and still try to have mutual respect for each other. And yeah, I think that's something that I feel like you've modeled to me. I think this has been a good and productive conversation and discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that I can have more with different voices on this channel, whether critic or apologist, and that we can lay down our weapons of war and not see each other as enemies, or that we're having to attack or try to debunk each other, and see our commonalities in a way.
yeah, I agree. I'm on Team Murph there too. Um, I when I went to college, there was a lot of diversity of opinion. We'd have people come speak on all ends of the political and philosophical spectrum, and we would go listen to them talk. And I don't know if it's social media, I don't know if it's generational, but I sense that we've become much more divisive. Like,
Yeah,
we want to cancel people who say things that offend us, or that vehemently disagree with us. um
yeah, they
and
have no credibility. Yeah,
and
just dismiss them. And I think you should listen to the other voices, even voices that you might disagree with that might challenge your position. That can be healthy. I
I
think
think
it can help you be more
leaning in
open-minded.
I think we need to lean in to relationships and conversations. I think we're better for it. uh but we are in a precarious time, I think, because I think social media and online news and things like that and cable TV news have made political and religious discourse more divisive.
Yeah,
um
and contentious.
so yeah, so I think it's one person at a time doing the kinds of things that you're doing, uh to lean into difficult conversations and nourish relationships, and trust, depending on the meaning that you attribute to God, trust that God is in the lives of his children, right? Not just the fraction of 1% who are active believing members of the church.
Yeah,
um, and for people who have lost belief or experience a shift of belief, to also hold some grace and nuance, that there are people who are really fed by and thrive in their participation in the church. And there are people for whom the church works really well. um, and to hold grace that uh, individuals overall seem to, unless they're like extreme narcissists, overall individuals tend to be doing what they think is the right thing to do.
I agree. I agree. Well, Anthony, this has been it's been so awesome, having you on and for our
Thank you.
interviews. I've really enjoyed your thoughtful, theories and your thoughts on the Book of Mormon, and this one on just post having a faith crisis and navigating mixed faith relationships and civil dialogue between critics and apologists and believers and non-believers. And um, yeah, thank you so much for coming on and for your kindness, your humility. Everyone check out his YouTube channel, Life After Deconstruction. I'll put some links in the description. And if you've enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, like, share, and subscribe to my channel, Mormonism with the Mirth. I'll see you next time on more content. Thank you, Anthony.
Thank you.